The storm rattled the stable doors, rain lashing like a whip against the Montana night. Clara Whitmore pressed her back to the rough boards, clutching the worn leather of her satchel as heavy boots crunched over wet straw. A tall shadow filled the doorway, a silhouette cut from the darkness, his voice low and rough as gravel when he spoke. "You're trespassing." His steel-gray eyes pinned her in place. Her breath caught in her throat, a knot of ice and fear. This wasn't just a man. This was a wall, a force of nature as wild as the storm itself. In that moment, Clara knew this wasn't shelter. This was a test. A storm fiercer than any weather she had ever faced. Clara Whitmore hadn't come to the Montana Territory looking for kindness. Kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd come because the rail line ended here, in the mud and grit of Hamilton. She'd come because no one from her past, from the life she'd torched behind her, could track her across these jagged mountains. The Bitterroot Valley whispered of work for those desperate enough to take it, and Clara was the definition of desperate. She was weary down to her bones, proud enough not to beg, but smart enough to know she was one step away from it. The storm that blew in overnight had left the town dripping and gray. Wooden storefronts sagged under the weight of the rain, and wagons slogged through mud as thick and dark as molasses. Clara had wandered for hours, her satchel a pathetic shield clutched to her chest, before the dim, flickering light of a lantern drew her to the only place that smelled of something other than despair. A stable. It smelled of horses and hay and safety. But safety wasn't what she found. Logan Mallister, the man who filled the doorway, was carved from the same timber as the mountains that loomed over his land. Broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and sorrow, and utterly immovable. His reputation stretched farther than his sprawling cattle herds. A widower, a rancher, a man who'd buried his heart 6 feet under with his wife and now lived for only 2 things: his land and his child. His gray eyes scanned Clara like a ledger, tallying up her strengths and her weaknesses in the space of a single cold breath. She looked like a drowned rat, mud clinging to the hem of her dress, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. But she lifted her chin, a small act of defiance, refusing to shrink beneath the crushing weight of his gaze. If she buckled now, she was finished. The wolves of her past would catch up, and the cold of the Montana winter would do the rest. "I need work," she said, her voice a reedy thing, but she forced it steady. "I can handle horses, better than most men." The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, until one of the mares in a nearby stall stamped its hoof, the sound cracking the tension like a whip. Logan studied her, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. For a terrible instant, Clara was certain he would toss her out into the mud, back into the storm. But then something flickered deep in his eyes. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't trust. It was something far more raw, recognition. He knew what it was to stand on the edge of a cliff with nothing left to hold on to but sheer, stubborn pride. Clara's stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. She wasn't sure if that recognition would be the thing that saved her, or the thing that ultimately ruined her. Logan leaned against the stable post, the movement slow and deliberate, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. The lamplight threw sharp, unforgiving angles across his jaw. Clara had seen men like him before, back in the world she'd fled. Men, too, used to being obeyed, too quick to dismiss a woman as fragile and useless. She braced herself for the inevitable dismissal she knew was coming. "You handle horses, you say?" His voice was a low rumble, laced with skepticism, but there was a sliver of something else in there, a challenge. "Yes," Clara said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I grew up breaking colts. My father bred thoroughbreds." The lie of omission sat bitter on her tongue. She wouldn't tell him how that life, with its sprawling estates and its silken dresses, had ended. She wouldn't tell him about the shouting, the gunshot, the blood on the library floor. She wouldn't tell him why she'd run so far west her feet had bled. Logan's brow rose a fraction of an inch. Most women don't boast of breaking colts. Most women don't have to. She shot back, her chin tipping higher, daring him to push her further. The silence stretched again, broken only by the restless shifting of the horses in their stalls. They could feel the tension radiating between the two humans, a palpable, electric current. Then, without any warning, Logan jerked his head toward the nearest stall. Inside, a big chestnut gelding snorted and snapped at the air, its eyes rolling white with fear and agitation. "Prove it," he said simply. The two words were a gauntlet thrown at her feet. Clara didn't hesitate for a second. Hesitation was death. She moved past him, slid the heavy wooden latch free, and stepped into the stall. The air was thick with the animal's panic. It throbbed against her skin, a wild, frantic energy. The horse shied away, muscles bunched like coiled springs. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she just stood there, letting the horse see her, smell her. She pressed her own fear down, burying it deep where it couldn't poison the air. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady, like slow-moving river water. "Easy, boy," she murmured. "Easy now. No one's here to hurt you." She spoke to him in a low, crooning tone, talking about nothing, about the rain on the roof and the smell of the hay. She moved slowly, never taking her eyes off his. She didn't approach him with a rope or a bridle. She approached him with a promise of peace. Inch by inch, she closed the distance. Finally, she pressed her palm flat against the horse's trembling shoulder. The animal's panic pulsed through her arm, but she held her ground. She stroked his neck, her hand tracing slow, deliberate, confident lines. The gelding's ears flicked back and forth, listening. His ragged breathing began to ease, the snorts quieting. The minutes ticked by, each one a small victory. By the time she finally looped the halter over his head, the stable had gone completely quiet, save for the horse's steady, contented chewing. When she turned back, Logan was still there, leaning against the post. His gray eyes hadn't softened, not really, but they carried something new. Something she hadn't seen before. Respect. Reluctant, rough-edged, and as real as the dirt on the floor. "You've got a hand for it," he admitted, the words sounding like they were pulled from him against his will. Clara's pulse hammered with a fierce, hot relief, but she kept her face a placid mask. She couldn't show weakness. Not now. "Then I'll take the job." He studied her again, as though trying to measure just how far he could trust a stray who had wandered in from a storm. He looked like he was about to argue, to lay down a list of rules and warnings, but before he could answer, a soft voice drifted from the doorway. "Pa?" Clara turned. A boy of about 10 stood there, his dark hair tousled from sleep, his bare feet muddy from the yard. His eyes were the same storm gray as his father's, but they held a softness, a quiet curiosity that only children still dared to show in a world this hard. In one small hand, he clutched a little wooden horse, worn smooth and dark from years of handling. Logan's entire expression shifted. It was almost imperceptible, like a glacier moving, but the hardness around his jaw eased. The steel in his eyes seemed to melt just a little as he looked at his son. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer than Clara would have thought possible. "Back to bed. It's late." But the boy's gaze had already landed on Clara, wide and assessing. "Who's she?" Clara swallowed, suddenly aware of the mud caked on her skirt and the bone-deep weariness etched into her face. She offered a small, tentative smile. "Just someone hoping for a chance." Ethan tilted his head, studying her for a long moment. Then a slow grin spread across his face, a gap-toothed flash of mischief that stirred something unfamiliar and strangely warm deep in her chest. It was a feeling she thought had died a long time ago. Logan's voice cut through the moment, steady and unyielding once more. "You'll start in the morning. We'll see if you last." Clara nodded once, her throat too tight to speak. It wasn't approval, not yet. But it was a door, cracked open just wide enough for her to slip through if she dared. As the storm outside finally faded to a persistent drizzle, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to waste this chance. It was the only one she had left. The Bitterroot Valley glistened in the pale, watery light of morning. The storm's fury had been washed clean, leaving behind a damp, profound silence. Clara was up before the rooster crowed, her body aching. The unfamiliar bed in the small room off the kitchen of the Mallister ranch house had offered little rest. Her dreams had been a chaotic tangle of running, of shouting voices, and the cold, accusing eyes of the man she'd left behind. She pulled on her worn boots, braided her dark hair with quick, practiced fingers, and stepped out into the chill. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, a scent so different from the perfumed parlors of her old life. It was a far cry from the life she'd known, a world of ballrooms, silken gloves, and her father's endless, suffocating insistence that she marry well, that she marry him, that life had shattered in one violent, terrible night, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, a few coins in her satchel, and the one skill she'd clung to since childhood: horses. Out here, surrounded by unforgiving mountains, and a sky that went on forever. That one skill might be enough to keep her alive, if she was lucky. By the time she reached the corral, Logan was already there, his broad shoulders squared against the morning chill as he flung hay into the feed trough. He didn't look up as she approached, but she could feel his awareness settle on her like a physical weight. He knew she was there. "You're early," he said, his voice flat, without welcome. "You told me to start," Clara answered, grabbing a pitchfork and matching his steady rhythm. Her arms ached from yesterday's frantic journey, a deep burning protest in her muscles, but she refused to show it. She would not give him a single reason to think she was weak. He glanced at her sideways, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been the ghost of amusement. "Most give up after the first morning." "Then I'm not most." The words hung between them, sharper than she'd intended, but she didn't regret them. If she had learned anything in her flight across the country, it was that respect wasn't given freely. It was taken. Hours later, sweat streaked her brow as she worked a restless black mare in the round pen. The horse circled, nostrils flaring, every muscle in its powerful body taut with defiance. It was a battle of wills, and Clara knew she couldn't afford to lose. Her voice carried low and steady, a constant, soothing murmur, her body loose and relaxed, mirroring a calm she didn't entirely feel. Logan leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching her with the keen, critical eye of a man who'd seen plenty of greenhorns wreck themselves on a horse's back. He was waiting for her to fail. But Clara didn't fail. She matched the mare's nervous energy stride for stride, easing closer, then retreating, a silent dance of pressure and release. She wasn't breaking the horse's spirit. She was convincing it to trust her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the animal's head dropped. It licked its lips and chewed, the classic signs of surrender. Clara approached slowly, slipped the halter on without a fuss, and stroked the mare's damp neck with a gentle hand. Logan's silence spoke louder than any words of praise could have. When he finally gave a single, curt nod, the gesture was small, but it carried the weight of a treaty signed. Clara allowed herself the barest hint of a smile. This was a start. It wasn't only horses that marked her days. Ethan trailed after her like a quiet shadow, his little wooden horse clutched tight in his hand. At first he barely spoke, just watched her with his father's weary curiosity. But one afternoon, as she sat on the porch mending a broken bridle strap, he edged closer. You talk to them, he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Clara looked up from her work. The horses, he clarified, nodding toward the corral. They understand more than most people think, she replied, handing him the leather strap to hold steady for her. Sometimes they just need someone to listen. Ethan's gray eyes brightened, a tiny spark of trust flickering to life. From that day on, he became her constant companion. He brought her a stream of questions about horses, about the far-off places she'd been, about whether the stars looked the same in other parts of the world. She answered his questions carefully, always skirting the truth of her past. She told him stories, but they were borrowed stories, tales of a girl who wasn't her, from a life she hadn't lived. But with him, the guarded, broken edges of her heart began to soften. He was a balm to a wound she hadn't even known was still bleeding. Logan noticed. She would catch him watching them, his expression unreadable, a mixture of something she couldn't quite name. One evening, she was kneeling beside Ethan on the porch steps, helping him carefully carve new legs for his toy horse with her small whittling knife. When she looked up, Logan was standing in the doorway, just watching. The tension in his jaw told her he wasn't untouched by the sight. Still, the man kept his distance. For every small acknowledgement he gave her, a nod at her work with a difficult colt, a slightly softened tone when he spoke of Ethan, there was a wall behind his eyes, a barrier she couldn't seem to breach. Clara knew grief when she saw it. It was the same hollowed-out look she saw in her own reflection sometimes. It was a kind of grief that clung like a second skin, too heavy to ever shed. His was a fortress, but fortresses, she knew, were made to be breached. One night, as a cold wind howled across the valley, a lonely sound that spoke of the coming winter, Logan found her in the stable. She was brushing down the chestnut gelding, the same one she'd calmed on her first night. His shadow stretched long and dark in the lantern light. "You've got Ethan smiling again," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet barn. Clara's hand stilled on the horse's glossy neck. "He's a good boy. He just needs someone to see him." Logan's gaze fixed on her, and for a split second, she saw something raw and vulnerable flicker there before he shuttered it away, turning his face toward the shadows. "Don't make promises you can't keep." The words cut sharper than he probably intended, but she understood their source. He'd lost someone he loved. He had built these walls to ensure he would never risk that kind of pain again. He wouldn't risk letting his son love someone who might disappear. Clara swallowed the ache that rose in her chest. She forced her voice to be as steady as his. "I don't make promises, Mr. Mallister. I just do what needs doing." The silence that followed was thick and charged with something neither of them dared to name. It was a dangerous, fragile thing taking root between them, and in that silence, Clara realized with a jolt of fear that the storm between them wasn't just brewing anymore. It was inevitable, and it was getting closer. The first snow came early that year, sweeping down from the high peaks like a ghostly warning. By late October, the Bitterroot Valley lay under a thin, crystalline blanket of white. Every rancher knew the race was on. They had to bring in the last of their supplies from town before the mountain passes closed for the winter, sealing them off from the rest of the world until spring. Logan hitched a team to the heavy supply wagon at dawn, the air so cold it burned in their lungs. He was loading the last of the trade goods, preparing for the long, treacherous journey to Hamilton. Clara stood at his side, pulling her thin shawl tight against the bitter wind that sliced through her clothes. "You'll need an extra hand," she said. It wasn't a question. His jaw flexed, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "The trail's rough. Weather's getting worse." "I've seen worse," she countered, and before he could argue further, she stepped up onto the wagon's bench. She set her satchel at her feet and met his stare head-on. "You want me gone? Say so plain. Otherwise, I'm coming with you." For a long, tense moment, his gray eyes searched hers, looking for a crack, a hint of doubt. He found none. With a low sigh that clouded in the frozen air, he climbed onto the seat beside her and clicked the reins. The wagon jolted forward, its iron-rimmed wheels crunching on the new snow. The road was treacherous, a frozen track rutted with ice. The horses strained against the weight of the wagon, their breaths pluming in the air. They rode in silence for hours, the only sounds the creak of wood and leather, and the lonely whistle of the wind through the pines. Hours later, as they rounded a sharp bend near the river, the lead horse shied violently. A large fallen branch, half buried in the snow, looked like a predator crouching in the shadows. The sudden movement spooked the entire team. They lunged forward, a panicked, uncontrolled run. "Hold them steady!" Logan barked, sawing at the reins, his muscles straining as he fought the terrified animals. Clara was already on her feet, her balance sure on the bucking wagon. She scrambled forward, grabbing the bridle straps of the nearest horse, her voice cutting sharp and steady through the chaos. "Easy, boys! Whoa now! Easy!" She leaned with the team, her small weight adding to his, matching their frantic rhythm until the frenzy finally bled away into shuddering exhaustion. At last, the wagon slowed, its wheels biting deep into a snowbank at the side of the trail, coming to a halt at a dangerous angle. They sat there for a moment, chests heaving, their breaths clouding in the frigid air. Logan's hands trembled slightly against the reins, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice hoarse. "So could you," Clara shot back. Her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her voice stayed impossibly calm. "We did what had to be done." His gaze snapped to hers, raw and completely unguarded for the first time. "That's what my wife used to say." The words slipped out, unplanned and heavy with memory. For an instant, Logan looked startled, like a man caught revealing a secret he hadn't meant to share. He turned away quickly, staring out at the frozen landscape, but not before Clara saw the profound pain etched deep into the lines of his face. She spoke softly, her voice the same one she used with frightened horses. "Losing someone doesn't mean you have to stop needing help, Logan." He didn't answer, but as they worked together to guide the team back onto the trail, his shoulder brushed against hers. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a silent truce in the war he'd been fighting with himself. By the time they reached Hamilton, the snow had thickened, flakes swirling in the air like feathers torn from the sky. They unloaded the goods together at the general store, moving with an unspoken rhythm, an easy partnership that felt both new and ancient. Inside the store, the townsfolk eyed Clara with open curiosity, whispers trailing in her wake like smoke. But Logan's solid presence beside her silenced most of them. His reputation was a shield stronger than any iron. On the long ride home, night fell early, the sky bruised with the dark purple of more storm clouds. Without a word, Logan spread his heavy wool coat across both of their shoulders. Clara felt the heat of him, steady and solid, a comfort she hadn't realized she was craving. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean, just a little. When they finally pulled into the ranch yard, exhausted and half frozen, Ethan was waiting on the porch. He held a lantern high, and the relief that flooded his young face was a beacon in the dark. Clara climbed down from the wagon, and before she could think better of it, she knelt in the snow and pulled him into her arms. His small body trembled, and he clung to her as though he was afraid she might vanish into the swirling snow. Logan stood a step behind them, just watching. His expression was as unreadable as ever. But something had shifted between them on that frozen road. The thick walls he'd built around his heart had finally cracked, just enough to let a little bit of light through. That night, as Clara lay awake in her small bed, listening to the wind batter the shutters, she knew the truth with a terrifying certainty. She was no longer just a hired hand fighting for her next meal. She was becoming part of something fragile, something worth protecting. And that terrified her more than any storm, or any man she'd left behind, because things worth protecting were things that could be lost. Winter deepened, hard and fast. The valley froze under sullen gray skies, and each morning brought a sharper, more vicious bite of cold. Clara threw herself into the relentless rhythm of the ranch, her muscles growing hard, her heart binding itself tighter and tighter to the sound of Ethan's laughter and the sight of Logan's rare, quiet nods of approval. But peace on the frontier was a fragile, fleeting thing, a mirage that could vanish in a heartbeat. The warning came just after dawn, the sound of hoofbeats, frantic and desperate, tearing across the frozen ground. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Billy, burst into the yard, his face red from the cold and pale with panic. "Rustlers!" he gasped, stumbling to a halt before Logan. "Took a dozen head from the south pasture, left tracks heading toward the ridge." Logan's face hardened instantly, his eyes turning to chips of flint. "Get the men! We ride!" Clara's pulse kicked into a frantic rhythm. "You'll need me." "You'll stay here," Logan snapped, his voice sharp as a shard of ice. "Protect Ethan!" But even as he spoke, Ethan ran from the house and tugged at Clara's hand, his small face a mask of fear. She couldn't stand by and do nothing while danger bore down on this place, on these people. She had spent too long running. She wasn't running anymore. "I can track," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And I can shoot. You know I can." Logan hesitated, his jaw clenched tight. Every instinct screamed at him to keep her here, to keep her safe, to keep Ethan's fragile world from shattering again. But the fierce determination blazing in her eyes was a mirror of his own. He saw the same grit, the same refusal to break. Finally, with a frustrated curse, he strode into the tack room and came back with a rifle. He thrust it into her hands. "Stay close. Don't take any stupid risks." They rode hard, a small posse against the vast, empty landscape. Snow stung their faces, and the wind carried the acrid scent of gunpowder long before they saw the rustlers. It was a ragged band of men, driving the stolen cattle up the rocky slope of the ridge, their rifles slung across their saddles. They were sloppy, and they were confident. Logan raised his hand, signaling his men to fan out, to circle around and cut off their escape. The first shot cracked across the valley, the sound echoing off the cliffs. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, horses screamed, and the stolen cattle bellowed in confusion. Clara dismounted, pressing herself low against a snow-covered boulder, the rifle braced against her shoulder. Her breath puffed white in the frigid air. She steadied her aim, her focus narrowing until all she saw was one of the rustlers swinging his weapon toward Logan, who was exposed in the open. There was no time to think. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang true. The man dropped from his saddle, his rifle clattering onto the rocks. Clara's heart lurched, a sickening jolt of horror and triumph. Her hands trembled, but she didn't falter. She reloaded, her movements swift and sure, covering Logan as he charged forward. The skirmish was fast and brutal. When the surviving rustlers finally scattered, melting back into the trees, they left 3 of their own lying still in the snow. The pristine white ground was trampled and stained with patches of crimson. Clara's body shook with the aftershock, her pulse roaring in her ears. Logan strode toward her, his face a thunderous mask, his eyes blazing with a terrifying fire. He gripped her arms, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You could have been killed," he roared, his voice cracking. "So could you," she shot back, her own voice trembling with adrenaline and fury. "Would you rather I stood by and watched it happen?" For a breathless moment, they stood inches apart, anger and fear, and a dozen other unnamed emotions colliding between them like sparks on flint. Logan's chest heaved, his hands still gripping her as though he couldn't decide whether to shake her or pull her close. Finally, he let out a ragged breath, his grip easing. "Damn it, Clara," he whispered, the sound raw. "You saved my life." Her throat tightened, the weight of his words pressing against the fragile walls she had so carefully built around her heart. "And you would have done the same for me." He didn't answer, because they both knew it was the truth. By the time they drove the cattle back to the ranch, dusk was falling, painting the snow in shades of purple and gray. Ethan ran from the porch, relief flooding his face as he flung himself first at Logan, then at Clara. She held the boy tight, burying her face in his hair, her hands still trembling, her heart still raw and exposed. She had taken a life to save a life. The math was simple, but the feeling was not. That night, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, Logan lingered in the doorway of the kitchen. Clara sat at the table, stitching a torn sleeve on one of Ethan's shirts, her fingers working automatically. His gaze was softer now, shadowed by the weight of what they had faced together in the snow. "You don't scare easy," he said quietly. Clara looked up, meeting his eyes across the dimly lit room. "Neither do you." The silence stretched, charged and heavy with unspoken things. But somewhere in that quiet space, a truth settled between them, a truth that neither of them could deny any longer. They had been tested by the storm, by the trail, by fire, and they had not broken. But as Clara looked at him, a new, cold fear began to creep in. One of the rustlers she had shot. As he fell, she had seen his face clearly. And on his neck, just below his ear, was a tattoo, a small coiled snake, a symbol she had not seen in years, a symbol she had prayed she would never see again, the mark of the men who worked for Silas Blackwood, the man who had framed her for her father's murder. They hadn't been random rustlers, they had been hunting for her, and now they knew where she was. The storm hadn't passed. It was just beginning. The ranch house lay wrapped in a profound silence, the only sound the mournful howl of the wind rattling the shutters. Clara sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, the mending forgotten. Her body still hummed with the memory of gunfire, but it was the image of the coiled snake tattoo that burned in her mind. They had found her. The past she had run from had finally caught up. Bootsteps creaked on the floorboards. She looked up to find Logan standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "You should be asleep," she said softly. "So should you." He crossed the room, each step slow and deliberate, as though the short distance between them carried the weight of years. He stopped before her chair, close enough that the flickering firelight etched the lines of grief and strength across his face. "I told myself," he began, his voice low and raw, "that I'd never let anyone close again. I buried my heart with my wife. I thought it was safer that way. For me. For Ethan." Clara swallowed hard, her own carefully constructed walls trembling under the force of his confession. "I understand," she whispered. "I ran from everything I knew because I thought hiding was safer. But safety isn't living, Logan. It's just surviving." And now, her survival was in question. He dropped to one knee before her, the firelight casting a halo around his dark hair. For the first time, the guarded steel in his eyes broke completely, leaving only the man beneath, tired, scarred, but filled with a powerful, yearning hope. "When I saw you stand up to those rustlers, when I see the way Ethan smiles again because of you," his voice faltered, then steadied with resolve, "I knew I couldn't keep pretending. Clara Whitmore, I don't just need your skill with horses or your strength with a rifle. I need you. Will you be my wife?" Her breath caught, a painful, sharp intake of air. The proposal was a beacon of hope in a sea of terror. For so long she had lived with nothing but fear and the constant ache of running. Now, here in this wild, unforgiving land, a good man had laid his heart bare before her. A man she was putting in terrible danger just by existing near him. To say yes was to bind him and his son to her fate, to the violence that was coming for her. To say no was to walk away from the only home, the only love she had found. Tears stung her eyes, hot and sharp. Her voice, when it came, was a choked whisper. Yes, Logan, yes. Relief crashed across his face, fierce and unrestrained. He rose, pulling her up from the chair and into his arms. His lips found hers, not with gentleness, but with the desperate urgency of a man who had been starving for years and had finally found sustenance. For one brief, perfect moment, Clara allowed herself to feel whole. Not because he had saved her, but because together they had chosen to fight, to live, to love. But as she clung to him, the image of the snake tattoo burned behind her eyelids. She had just said yes to a future, but in doing so, she may have just signed his death warrant. The days that followed were a strange mixture of quiet joy and rising dread. Logan was a different man. The walls around his heart had not just cracked, they had crumbled. He smiled more, a real smile that reached his storm-gray eyes. He and Ethan and Clara fell into the easy rhythm of a family, eating meals together, sharing stories by the fire. They were planning a small wedding, a simple ceremony in the spring, once the passes cleared. For Clara, it was a beautiful, painful dream she was terrified of waking from. Every hoofbeat in the distance, every shadow at dusk, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. One afternoon, Logan was in the attic, sorting through some of his late wife's belongings, preparing to pack them away. He came down the ladder with a small, leather-bound diary in his hand, a frown creasing his brow. "I never saw this before," he said, handing it to Clara. "It must have been tucked away." Clara opened it. The handwriting was elegant, looping. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about the weather, the price of cattle. But then, one entry from the week before her death caught Clara's eye. "SB grows impatient. He says Logan will never sell. He speaks of a more permanent solution. I am afraid." This was not the plan. "SB?" Clara asked, her voice tight. Logan's face grew dark. "Silas Blackwood, our neighbor to the east. We've had land disputes for years. He always wanted our waterfront pasture." He paused, his eyes distant. "My wife, Sarah, her horse stumbled near the ridge that marks our property line. A tragic accident," the sheriff said. He took the diary from her, his gaze locking on the entry. She was afraid of him. A new, cold anger began to smolder in his eyes, replacing the old, quiet grief. Her death? Maybe it wasn't an accident at all. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees went weak, and she had to grip the back of a chair to keep from falling. Silas Blackwood. The name echoed in the silent room, a death knell from her past. The man who wanted Logan's land was the same man who had stolen her life. The man who had murdered her father and laid the blame at her feet. The man whose hired guns wore the tattoo of a coiled snake. It wasn't a coincidence. Her past and Logan's past were not two separate storms. They were the same hurricane, and it was about to make landfall right here, in the heart of their fragile, newfound family. Logan saw the look on her face. "Clara, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," she whispered, the truth finally spilling out, a torrent of poison she could no longer contain. "Logan, I know Silas Blackwood." The air crackled. The quiet joy of the last few days evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying reality. Logan listened, his face a mask of stone, as Clara's story tumbled out. The lies, the frame-up, the murder of her father, her desperate flight west. The rustlers hadn't been a random attack, they were Blackwood's scouts, confirming he'd found his prize. Her secret was a lit fuse, and she had just brought it into his home. When she finished, silence descended. Logan stared into the fire, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't looking at her with pity, or anger, or betrayal. He was looking at the flames with a cold, calculating fury. "He didn't just kill my wife," Logan said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "He tried to take everything from both of us." He finally turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was now forged with something harder, something unbreakable. "You're not running anymore, Clara. We're not running. This ends here, in this valley." A new sense of purpose settled over them. They were no longer just victims of circumstance. They were partners in a war. They spent the next few days preparing, not for a wedding, but for a siege. Logan sent his most trusted ranch hand to the next county to fetch the sheriff, a man he knew wasn't in Blackwood's pocket. They reinforced the doors, cleaned every rifle, and kept Ethan close, never letting him out of their sight. They knew Blackwood would not wait for the law. He would come for Clara, and he would come for the land he believed was his. The attack came at dusk, just as they knew it would, not with a frontal assault, but with cunning. A fire erupted in the main barn. As Logan and his men rushed to fight the flames, a second group of Blackwood's men stormed the house. Clara was ready. She met them at the door, rifle in hand. The first man through went down before he knew what hit him. But there were too many. They swarmed her, one of them grabbing Ethan, holding a knife to his throat. "Drop the rifle, little lady," the man snarled, his face cruel in the flickering light from the burning barn. "Or the boy gets it." Clara's blood ran cold. She let the rifle clatter to the floor. As they dragged her and the terrified child out into the yard, she saw Silas Blackwood himself, sitting on his horse, watching the barn burn with a satisfied smirk. He was older, colder, but it was the same face from her nightmares. "Clara, dear," he said with mock affection, "did you really think you could hide from me?" He gestured toward the burning barn. "A pity about your new home. Now be a good girl and tell my men where Mallister keeps his deed." Just then, Logan appeared from the smoke, his face blackened with soot, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. He held a shotgun, leveled and steady. "Let them go, Blackwood." Blackwood laughed. "You're a sentimental fool, Mallister, just like your wife. She was so easy to persuade. A few pretty words, a promise of a better life away from this dirt heap." He was gloating, certain of his victory, but his words had the opposite effect. Hearing the truth of his wife's betrayal spoken so callously didn't break Logan. It freed him. The last vestiges of his grief burned away, leaving only pure, cold rage. "She made her choice," Logan said, his voice deadly calm. "Now you get to make yours." In that split second of distraction, Clara acted. She drove her elbow hard into the gut of the man holding her, while simultaneously stomping on the instep of the man holding Ethan. The man holding the boy grunted in pain, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. "Ethan, run!" she screamed. The boy scrambled away as gunshots erupted. It was chaos. Logan fired, taking down 2 of Blackwood's men. Clara dove for her fallen rifle. Blackwood, enraged, drew his own pistol and aimed not at Logan, but at the fleeing boy. Clara screamed, "No!" and threw herself in the path of the bullet. Pain, white-hot and searing, exploded in her shoulder. She crumpled to the ground, the world spinning into a dark, roaring tunnel. The last thing she saw was Logan, his face a mask of primal fury, charging at Blackwood, tackling him from his horse. When she woke, the world was quiet. The burning barn had been reduced to smoldering embers. The sun was rising, casting a pale pink light over the snow. Logan was kneeling beside her, his face streaked with soot and tears. Ethan was there too, holding her hand, his small face pale. "You're okay," Logan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The bullet went clean through. "Blackwood?" she breathed, the pain in her shoulder a dull, heavy throb. "He won't be bothering anyone again," Logan said, his voice grim. The sheriff had arrived in the middle of the fight, and between his testimony and the discovery of Sarah's diary, Blackwood's reign was over. His surviving men had surrendered. Justice, Frontier style had been served. The storm was finally over. The real one. Spring came slow to the Bitterroot Valley, the snow receding inch by inch until green shoots pushed bravely through the thawing earth. The small white church in Hamilton stood proud against the budding hills, its steeple catching the warm Sunday light. Inside, the pews were filled. Neighbors, ranchers, and townsfolk had all come to witness the union of Logan Mallister and the mysterious woman who had saved his life and his heart. Clara stood at the entrance, her arm in a sling, but her smile was radiant. Her simple dress brushed her boots, and a sprig of wildflowers was tucked into her braid. Her name was cleared, her past was buried, and her future was standing at the altar. Ethan tugged at her good hand, beaming up at her. "We're a family now," he whispered, his voice filled with a child's pure joy. She smiled, crouching to his level. "Yes, we are." Together, they walked down the aisle toward the man waiting for them. Logan's gray eyes were soft, steady, and filled with a love that was stronger for having been tested by fire. When he took her hand, it was with the certainty of a man who knew he was holding his entire world. The vows were simple, but their voices carried the weight of truth, of survival, of a hard-won peace. As they stood outside later, the valley stretching wide and wild around them, Logan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Ethan wedged himself between them, clutching both their hands. The wind carried the scent of pine and new life. Life on the frontier would never be easy. There would always be storms, but now they would face them together. Clara lifted her face to the light, feeling the warmth on her skin, and knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was finally home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next tale from the Untamed West. And tell us in the comments, what was the twist that shocked you the most? Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching.